The wooden spoon scraped against cast iron in steady, hypnotic circles. Scrape. Stir. Scrape. Stir. The rhythm had not changed in 3 hours and 47 minutes, though Delphine had long stopped counting time in any way that resembled human measurement. Time had become something else entirely, something thick and viscous, like the contents of the pot before her, something that moved in loops and spirals rather than forward in a straight line. The fire beneath the massive pot crackled and hissed, fed by hickory logs that Delphine had selected with particular care the evening before. The flames cast writhing shadows across the rough-hewn walls of the kitchen house, across the hanging bundles of dried herbs that swayed though there was no breeze, across Delphine's face, a face that had become a mask of such profound serenity that it bordered on the otherworldly. Her dark eyes reflected the firelight but held no light of their own. They were windows to an empty room, a place where something human had once lived but no longer resided. The August heat hung in the air like a living thing, oppressive and suffocating even in these hours before dawn. It mixed with the heat radiating from the kitchen fire, creating an atmosphere so dense that breathing felt like drowning. Sweat ran down Delphine's temples, tracked along her jaw, dripped from her chin into the pot below, but she did not wipe it away. Her hand continued its circular motion, scrape, stir, as it had done since 1:30 in the morning, when the moon still hung fat and yellow over the cotton fields of Bleakwood Plantation. The smell that filled the kitchen house was rich and heavy, unmistakably meaty with an underlying sweetness that seemed wrong somehow, too cloying, too intimate. It was the smell of Sunday stew, of comfort and sustenance, of the careful alchemy that transformed raw flesh into nourishment. But there was something else woven through that familiar aroma, something that made the stomach clench and the throat tighten, though Delphine seemed not to notice. She hummed as she stirred, a tuneless melody that rose and fell without pattern or purpose, the kind of sound that might emerge from something that had once been human but was learning to be something else. Behind her, on the scarred wooden preparation table where she had chopped 10,000 onions and carved countless chickens, sat a bundle wrapped in burlap. The fabric was stained dark in places, and one corner of an embroidered blanket, pale blue with tiny yellow ducks, peeked out from the wrapping. The bundle was small. Terribly, impossibly small. Delphine had placed it there with reverent care after she finished her work, had arranged it just so, had even tucked the edges of the burlap in the way one might tuck bedclothes around a sleeping child. The burlap did not move. It had not moved in hours. Outside, the Arkansas darkness was beginning to surrender to dawn. Through the single window of the kitchen house, Delphine could see the first graying of the sky above the cypress trees that lined the eastern edge of the plantation. Soon the birds would begin their morning chorus. Soon the other enslaved people would emerge from their quarters to begin another day of labor under the merciless sun. Soon the overseer, Magnus Weatherby, would return from his trip to Little Rock, riding up the main road with his saddle creaking and his boots dusty and his expectations for a hot breakfast waiting. Soon Constance Weatherby would remember. But for now, in this suspended moment between darkness and light, between the old day and the new, Delphine stirred and hummed and waited with the patience of someone who had moved beyond waiting into a state of pure, terrible stillness. The pot bubbled. The fire crackled. The shadows danced. And in the depths of the cast iron, something pale occasionally surfaced before sinking again into the murky broth, something that might have been a potato or a parsnip but was neither of those things, something that should not have been there at all but was undeniably, horrifically present. Delphine's humming never faltered. Her hand never stopped its circular motion. When a log in the fire split with a sharp crack that sounded like breaking bone, she did not flinch. When a voice in her head, her own voice, or perhaps her grandmother's voice, or perhaps the voice of every woman who had ever been stripped of power and forced to swallow rage like poison, whispered that Constance would come soon, that the discovery was inevitable, that what followed would be unspeakable, Delphine simply stirred and hummed and watched the surface of the stew with eyes that had seen the worst thing possible and found peace in that seeing. The kitchen house had always been her domain, the only place on Bleakwood Plantation where her hands held any authority. Here she had fed the Weatherby family for 12 years, had learned their preferences and their schedules, had absorbed their casual cruelties with the same steadiness with which she now stirred. She had made their bread and their pies, their roasts and their soups, had seasoned their meat and sweetened their tea, had nourished the bodies of people who treated her own body as property no more valuable than livestock. But tonight, last night, she had cooked something different. Something that would ensure no one ever forgot her name. The sky continued its slow brightening. A rooster crowed in the distance, then another, then a chorus of them announcing the new day. Delphine heard footsteps on the path outside, Jeremiah, the stable hand, heading to feed the horses. His steps paused near the kitchen house door, and for a moment there was only silence. Could he smell it? Did he know? But then his footsteps resumed, faster now, hurrying away toward the relative safety of the stables where the horses at least could not speak of what they witnessed. Everyone would know soon enough. Delphine added another log to the fire, though the stew needed no more cooking. It had been ready hours ago. But she needed to keep stirring, needed to maintain the rhythm, needed to stay in this liminal space where thought could not quite reach her, and the enormity of what rested in the pot and what lay wrapped on the table behind her remained at a safe distance, viewed through a fog of profound dissociation. Her lips moved in a tuneless humming, but occasionally words emerged, fragments of an old song her grandmother had taught her, brought over from Africa in the hold of a ship whose name Delphine had never learned. Words in a language that was being forgotten, about gods that were being erased, about justice that came not from courts and laws but from older, darker places. Places where the powerless could still wield terrible power, where the oppressed could become oppressor for one perfect, terrible moment, where a cook could season a stew with the ultimate spice of revenge. The pot bubbled. The shadows danced. The bundle on the table remained still. And Delphine stirred, and hummed, and waited for Constance Weatherby to remember where she had left her baby. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe for more macabre horror stories, and let me know in the comments what you think happens next. 7 days before the pot began its terrible simmer, the heat had already turned vicious. The kind of Arkansas August heat that made the air shimmer above the cotton fields like water, that turned the red clay roads to dust, that drove the cicadas to a screaming frenzy in the oak and cypress trees. The Mississippi River Delta stretched vast and flat in all directions from Bleakwood Plantation, the land so heavy with humidity that clothes never truly dried and mold crept into every corner, every crevice, claiming what it could while the masters claimed everything else. Delphine stood in the doorway of the kitchen house that morning, watching the cotton inspection with the kind of vigilance that had become second nature. Her hands were submerged in a basin of water where she was supposed to be washing turnips, but her eyes never left the fields where Magnus Weatherby moved among the rows like a predator assessing his territory. He had changed in the 3 months since Constance had delivered baby Thaddeus, changed in ways that made Delphine's stomach clench with a fear she had learned to swallow like bile. The leather riding crop hung from his belt, tapping against his thigh as he walked. He had always been cruel, that was the nature of his position, the role he had been hired to play, but since becoming a father, his cruelty had acquired a new edge, something sharper and more personal. Perhaps he felt the need to prove something to himself, to demonstrate that domesticity had not softened him. Perhaps the vulnerability of having his own child in the world made him more vicious toward those who were vulnerable under his control. Or perhaps, Delphine thought as she watched him pause beside a row where Clementine was picking, he was simply a man who had always been a monster and now had less reason to hide it. Clementine was 16, tall and graceful despite the years of labor that had bent so many others. She had her father's height, though Delphine rarely allowed herself to think of the man who had been sold away when Clementine was 3, and her grandmother's proud bearing, the kind that could not be fully broken even by the weight of bondage. She moved down the cotton row with efficient grace, her fingers quick and practiced, her canvas sack already half full though the sun had barely cleared the horizon. Magnus stopped. Watched. The cicadas screamed their endless song. Delphine's hands tightened in the water basin, turnips forgotten. She knew that posture, that particular stillness in Magnus' shoulders. She had seen it before, directed at other girls, other women. The way his eyes tracked movement, calculated vulnerability, assessed what he could take because everything here belonged to him or to his employer, and the distinction made no practical difference when it came to power. "You there," Magnus called, his voice carrying across the field. "Clementine, isn't it?" Her daughter straightened, kept her eyes down. "Yes, sir." "Your rows look sparse. You're not pulling your weight." It was a lie. Delphine could see from the kitchen house that Clementine's row showed more progress than those on either side of her. But truth had no currency in conversations like these. Truth was a luxury afforded only to those who held the whip. "I'm working steadily, sir," Clementine said, voice carefully neutral, carefully small. Magnus stepped closer, into the row with her. Too close. The other workers kept their heads down, hands moving through the cotton bowls, eyes seeing nothing because to see meant to witness and to witness meant to become complicit or to invite retribution. The surveillance of plantation life worked in all directions, the masters watching the enslaved watching each other, everyone watching for infractions and violations and any excuse for punishment or any opportunity for survival. "You talking back to me, girl?" Magnus' hand moved to the crop at his belt. "No, sir. I apologize, sir." Clementine's shoulders hunched, making herself smaller, the instinctive mathematics of survival calculating how to defuse, how to de-escalate, how to become invisible. But Magnus didn't want to be invisible. He wanted to be seen wanting. That was the point. His hand reached out, ostensibly to examine the cotton in her sack, but his fingers brushed her shoulder, lingered there a moment too long. "You're growing up," he said, and the words carried a weight that made Delphine's breath catch in her throat. "Turning into quite the young woman." From the kitchen house, Delphine watched her daughter freeze, watching the careful blankness spread across Clementine's face like ice forming over water. She knew that blankness. Had worn it herself countless times. It was the only armor available to women who had no right to refuse, no ability to flee, no recourse to protection. Magnus' fingers trailed down Clementine's arm before he stepped back, satisfied with whatever he had established in that moment. "Get back to work," he said, already turning away to continue his inspection. "And pick up your pace. I'll be watching." That was the threat, of course. "I'll be watching." The words that hung over every moment, every interaction, the constant awareness that privacy was impossible, that safety was an illusion, that the only question was when violence would come, not if. Delphine forced herself to look away, to return her attention to the turnips whose skins she had been scrubbing raw without noticing. Her hands shook in the water. In the distance, a riverboat horn sounded on the Mississippi, some vessel heading south toward New Orleans with its cargo of cotton and whatever else the Delta produced, that long artery of commerce built on suffering that stretched from Memphis to the Gulf. The kitchen house was her only domain. The only place where her decisions mattered, where her knowledge held authority. She knew every inch of this space, the herbs hanging from the rafters that her grandmother had taught her to identify and use, not just for flavor but for other purposes whispered about only in the darkest hours. Pennyroyal for certain women's troubles. Pokeweed root in careful doses. Jimsonweed that could bring visions or death depending on preparation. Knowledge passed down from Africa, from indigenous peoples, from generations of women who had learned that the kitchen was the only battlefield where they might wield any weapon at all. The main house rose white and elegant beyond the workyard, its columns gleaming in the morning sun, its windows reflecting the sky like blind eyes. Inside, Constance Weatherby would be nursing baby Thaddeus, perhaps humming lullabies, perhaps planning the dinner menu, living in the careful fiction that this was a civilized place, that the wealth her family enjoyed grew from the soil rather than from the brutalized bodies that worked it. The Spanish moss hung thick from the cypress trees that lined the drive, gray and ghostly, swaying in the slight breeze that brought no relief from the heat. Delphine heard it before she saw it, the crack of leather against flesh, sharp as a rifle shot. Someone had moved too slowly, picked too little, met Magnus' eyes when they should have looked away. The sound echoed across the fields, followed by a strangled cry that was cut short because crying out only made it worse. The other workers kept picking, hands moving steadily, faces blank, because stopping to watch was its own form of insubordination. This was the rhythm of plantation life. Work and violence and surveillance and submission, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. This was the powder keg that Delphine had learned to navigate with the careful steps of someone walking through a room filled with traps, knowing that eventually, inevitably, one of those traps would spring. She had not known, watching Magnus touch her daughter that morning, that the trap had already been set. Had not known that the countdown had already begun. Had not known that in 7 days she would be standing over a pot in the pre-dawn darkness, stirring something that would ensure none of them would ever forget the names Delphine, Clementine, or Thaddeus Weatherby. But somewhere deep in her chest, in that place where her grandmother's voice still whispered of old gods and older justice, something had begun to wake. Something patient and cold and capable of terrible things. The turnips lay forgotten in the basin. Delphine's eyes returned to the fields, to her daughter moving through the cotton rows with her head down and her shoulders hunched, trying so hard to be invisible to the man who had decided to see her. And in the kitchen behind her, in the shadows where the herbs hung and the knives lay sharp and waiting, the space seemed to hold its breath. 3 days before the pot began to simmer, the afternoon sun hung white and merciless over Bleakwood Plantation. Delphine was in the kitchen house preparing the evening meal when she heard the scream. It was not the kind of scream that came from a stumble or a burn or even from the lash. It was the scream of something being torn, something fundamental and irreparable, a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the ancient part of the brain that recognized mortal danger. It was her daughter's voice, and it came from the direction of the barn. Delphine's hands froze above the cutting board. The knife clattered from her grip. Then she was running, her skirts gathered in fists, her bare feet pounding the hard-packed earth of the workyard. She knew what running meant, knew the consequences of abandoning her post, of presuming to act without permission, of believing for even a moment that her maternal instinct held more weight than her status as property. But knowledge meant nothing against the sound of that scream. The barn doors stood partially open. Inside, the shadows were thick despite the afternoon light. Delphine saw them immediately, Magnus with his back to the door, his suspenders hanging loose, his hand gripping Clementine's wrist hard enough to leave marks that would purple by evening. Her daughter's dress was torn at the shoulder. Her face was a rictus of terror. Stop. The word left Delphine's mouth before thought could intervene. Please, sir, please. Magnus turned, and the expression on his face was not surprise or shame but irritation at the interruption. Get out, he said, his voice flat and cold. This doesn't concern you. She's my daughter. Delphine moved forward, hands raised in supplication, in desperate plea. Please, sir, she's just a child, please. The first blow caught her across the temple, Magnus' open hand moving with the casual efficiency of someone swatting an insect. Delphine staggered, her vision exploding into stars. Before she could recover, his fist drove into her ribs, once, twice, and something inside her cracked with a sound like greenwood splitting. She collapsed to the barn floor, the straw and dust filling her mouth as she tried to breathe around the white-hot agony radiating from her chest. You will watch, Magnus said, dragging Delphine up by her hair until she was on her knees, her scalp screaming where his fingers twisted and pulled. She felt something warm running down the side of her face and realized distantly that he had split her skin. You will watch and understand what happens when property forgets its place. What followed existed outside of time, outside of language, outside of anything Delphine's mind could process as reality. She knelt in the straw with Magnus' hand locked in her hair, forcing her head upward, forcing her eyes open, and she watched her daughter disappear into herself the way a candle flame retreats before going out. Clementine's eyes went blank first, then her face went slack, and finally her body went limp, no longer fighting because fighting only prolonged it and because somewhere deep in her 16-year-old understanding, she had learned what all enslaved women eventually learned, that their bodies were not their own, that resistance was futile, that survival meant separating the self from the flesh being violated. Delphine tried to close her eyes, but Magnus yanked her hair harder, and she heard herself making sounds that were not quite words, not quite screams, just the formless noise of something breaking beyond repair. The barn smelled of hay and horse sweat and something else now, something that would never wash away, the smell of innocence being destroyed and power asserting itself through the most intimate violence possible. When it was over, when Magnus finally released Clementine and she collapsed to the barn floor like a puppet with cut strings, he turned his attention back to Delphine. His breathing was heavy but controlled. He straightened his clothing with methodical movements, then crouched beside her, his face close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. You will speak of this to no one, he said, each word deliberate and final. If I hear one whisper, one rumor, one sideways glance that suggests either of you opened your mouths, I will have you both sold to the sugar plantations in Louisiana. Do you understand what that means? Delphine understood. Everyone understood. The sugar plantations were death sentences, brutal labor that ground human beings to pulp within a few years, conditions that made even cotton slavery look merciful by comparison. It was the ultimate threat, the final punishment, the place where enslaved people were sent to disappear. Do you understand? Magnus repeated, his hand closing around Delphine's throat, not squeezing but promising. Yes, sir, she whispered through blood and tears and the taste of dirt. He released her and stood, adjusting his hat. Clean her up and get back to work. Supper better be ready on time. Then he walked out of the barn into the bright afternoon sunlight, leaving them in the shadows like broken things that no longer mattered. Delphine crawled to her daughter. Clementine lay curled on her side, her torn dress exposing the scratches and bruises already forming on her skin, but it was her eyes that made Delphine's heart fracture completely. They were open but empty, staring at nothing, reflecting nothing. Her daughter had gone somewhere unreachable, somewhere deep inside where the pain couldn't follow. "Clementine," Delphine whispered, gathering her daughter into her arms despite the screaming agony in her ribs. "Baby, I'm here. Mama's here." But Clementine didn't respond. Didn't blink. Didn't cry. She had retreated so far inward that Delphine wasn't sure she would ever find her way back. They sat in the barn straw for a time that might have been minutes or hours. Time had become unreliable, elastic, stretching and contracting in ways that defied measurement. Eventually Delphine managed to stand, to help Clementine to her feet, to guide her daughter's unresponsive body back toward the slave quarters. Other enslaved people saw them pass, saw the blood and the torn clothing and the vacant expression on Clementine's face, and their eyes slid away because to see meant to know and to know meant to carry the burden of knowledge with no ability to act upon it. Delphine cleaned her daughter with water from the well, changed her into a fresh dress, laid her on the pallet they shared. Clementine curled into a ball and began to rock, a barely perceptible forward and back motion, her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes still fixed on nothing. The rocking would continue for days. The silence would remain unbroken. That evening, Delphine returned to the kitchen house to finish preparing supper. Her ribs screamed with every breath. Blood had dried in her hair and on her face. Her hands shook so violently that she could barely hold the knife to slice the ham. But she worked because not working meant punishment, meant selling, meant losing even the proximity to her daughter that slavery allowed. She served the meal in the main house dining room, setting dishes before Magnus and Constance and baby Thaddeus in his cradle beside the table. Constance looked at Delphine's battered face with something that might have been concern or might have been annoyance at the disruption to the evening's aesthetic. "What happened to you?" Constance asked, her voice carrying that peculiar tone of willful ignorance that allowed plantation mistresses to maintain their illusions of civilization. "Fell, ma'am," Delphine said, the lie tasting like ash. "Clumsy." Constance's eyes flicked to Magnus, who was cutting his ham with precise movements, then back to Delphine. Something passed across the white woman's face, knowledge, perhaps, or suspicion, or simply the calculation that some truths were better left unexamined. "Be more careful," she said finally, and returned her attention to her plate. Magnus ate without looking up, without acknowledgement, as if Delphine were furniture, as if the afternoon had never happened, as if her daughter's hollow eyes and catatonic rocking were not his doing but simply the natural order of things. Delphine stood against the wall, hands clasped before her, waiting to be dismissed, and felt something inside her chest that was not her broken ribs. It was something colder and more fundamental, something that had been sleeping her entire life and was now waking with a hunger that terrified her. Her grandmother's voice whispered in her memory, stories told in the dark about the old gods who demanded balance, about justice that came not from law but from older sources, about power that could be claimed even by the powerless if they were willing to pay the price. The price, her grandmother had warned, was always terrible. The price was always everything. But Delphine had already lost everything. Her daughter's wholeness. Her own dignity. Any illusion that goodness or mercy or divine justice would intervene on behalf of the suffering. She had lost her faith in a world that made sense, in a God who cared, in any future that held hope. What was left, then, but the cold mathematics of revenge? That night, back in the quarters, Delphine lay beside her rocking daughter and stared at the darkness. Her hands, which had been shaking for hours, gradually grew still. Not the stillness of calm but the stillness of something deciding, something choosing a path from which there would be no return. Time began to behave strangely. She would find herself standing in the kitchen house with no memory of having walked there, her hand already wrapped around a knife handle, her eyes fixed on nothing. Hours would vanish. She would be chopping vegetables and then suddenly realize the sun had moved across the sky and she had no recollection of the intervening moments. Her thoughts fragmented, skittered sideways, and refused to form coherent patterns. Sometimes she was herself. Sometimes she was watching herself from a distance, seeing her own body move through tasks with mechanical precision while her mind floated somewhere else entirely. Sometimes she heard voices, her grandmother's voice, or voices older than her grandmother, speaking in languages she shouldn't understand but somehow did, whispering about herbs and timing and the care required for certain kinds of cooking. The kitchen knives began to fascinate her. She would stand before them in their neat row, studying the way light caught their edges, the way they divided things, the way they transformed the whole into pieces. She thought about cutting, Not in any organized way, not with any plan, just the abstract concept of severance, of separation, of taking something apart until it could no longer be what it was. Magnus came to the kitchen 3 days later to inform her that he would be riding to Little Rock on business, that he would be gone overnight, and that she should prepare provisions for his journey. He spoke to her as if the barn had never happened, as if her daughter was not currently rocking in catatonic silence in the quarters, as if the bruises on Delphine's ribs had not come from his fists. "Yes, sir," Delphine heard herself say, her voice calm, almost pleasant. "Safe travels, sir." After he left, she stood very still in the kitchen house and felt the decision settle over her like a shroud. Not a choice, exactly, because choice implied options and she had none. But an inevitability. A convergence of circumstances and opportunity and the cold thing that had taken up residence in her chest where her heart used to be. Her hands reached for the herbs hanging from the rafters without her conscious direction. They selected what they needed with the certainty of knowledge that came from somewhere deeper than learning. And as she began to plan the special stew she would prepare, Delphine felt the last tether connecting her to her humanity begin to fray. By the time it snapped completely, she would be standing over a pot at 4:47 in the morning, stirring something that should not exist, humming a tuneless melody while the world slept and her daughter rocked and the baby that had once been Thaddeus Weatherby found peace in the only way Delphine could provide it. But that was still 3 days away. For now, she simply stood in her kitchen, her only domain, her only power, and felt the cold thing inside her smile. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe for more macabre horror stories, and let me know in the comments what you think happens next. 2 days before the pot would simmer with its terrible contents, Delphine moved through the kitchen house like a ghost haunting its own life. Her hands performed the familiar tasks, kneading bread dough, plucking chickens, peeling potatoes, but they seemed to belong to someone else, operating with a precision that required no conscious thought. The rest of her existed somewhere distant, somewhere cold and calculating, somewhere that felt nothing at all. The other enslaved people noticed. How could they not? Jeremiah the stable hand delivered firewood to the kitchen and set it down without his usual attempt at conversation, his eyes sliding away from Delphine's face as if what he saw there frightened him more than any overseer's whip. Prudence, who worked in the main house, came to collect the breakfast tray and paused in the doorway, her mouth opening as if to speak before closing again. She knew. They all knew the way enslaved people learned to read suffering in each other's bodies, to recognize when someone had been pushed past the point where coming back was possible. But survival demanded silence. To speak meant to become entangled, to draw attention, to risk being pulled into whatever darkness was gathering around Delphine like storm clouds. So they said nothing, did nothing, and carried the weight of their knowing like stones in their pockets. Delphine worked on her stew preparations with ritual precision. She requested specific ingredients from the root cellar, turnips and carrots and onions, yes, but also certain herbs that Constance wouldn't think twice about. Time for flavoring. Bay leaves for depth. And tucked among them, pennyroyal and other plants whose purposes had been taught to her by her grandmother in whispered lessons, plants that could blur the line between medicine and poison, between nurturing and harm, depending on intention and dosage. The kitchen had become an altar. The massive cast-iron pot sat waiting like a cauldron from old stories, stories her grandmother had told about women who held power in their hands, who could brew life or death, who answered to gods older than the Christian God the masters worshipped on Sundays. Delphine arranged her ingredients with the care of someone preparing for the ceremony, each element placed just so, each measurement considered with mathematical precision. The old gods remember, her grandmother's voice whispered in her memory, words spoken decades ago but suddenly immediate and urgent. They hunger for balance. When the scales tip too far, when suffering becomes unbearable, they accept offerings. But the price, child, the price is always everything. Everything. Delphine had already paid everything. What more could be taken from a woman whose daughter had been destroyed, whose body had been beaten, whose humanity had been denied since birth? She had nothing left to lose except the cold clarity that now guided her hands. On Sunday morning, the plantation maintained its facade of civilization. Church bells rang from the small chapel where Constance and Magnus sat in the front pew, their faces appropriately pious as the visiting minister preached about forgiveness and grace and the divine order that placed some above and others below. Delphine stood in the back with the other enslaved people, her lips moving in approximations of hymns, her broken ribs aching with each breath, her mind entirely elsewhere. In the quarters that afternoon, she sat beside Clementine, who continued her endless rocking. Forward and back, the motion never ceasing, her daughter's eyes still vacant and unreachable. Sometimes blood appeared on Clementine's thighs, the violation had torn something inside her that wasn't healing properly, and Delphine would clean her gently, mechanically, while the cold thing in her chest grew colder still. "Mama will fix it," she whispered to her rocking daughter, though she knew Clementine couldn't hear her. "Mama will make the scales balance." Monday afternoon, Constance appeared in the kitchen house doorway with baby Thaddeus on her hip. The child was 3 months old, fat and healthy, his cheeks pink and his eyes bright with the kind of innocence that comes from never knowing hunger or fear or pain. He gurgled happily, reaching for his mother's pearl necklace. "Delphine," Constance said, her voice carrying that particular tone of casual command that assumed compliance. "Mr. Weatherby is riding to Little Rock tomorrow evening for business. He'll be gone overnight." "Yes, ma'am," Delphine said, her hands continuing to chop vegetables without pause. "And I've been meaning to visit my sister at Willowbrook. I haven't seen her since Thaddeus was born, and she's been asking after us." Constance adjusted the baby on her hip. "I was hoping you might watch him for a few hours tomorrow night while I make the visit. Just from supper until bedtime. I should be back by 9 o'clock. Something clicked into place behind Delphine's eyes. Not surprise, she had moved beyond surprise into a state where everything felt predestined, inevitable, as if she were watching events unfold that had already been written in some cosmic ledger. The universe was arranging itself, providing the opportunity, opening the door to the only kind of justice available to the powerless. "Of course, ma'am," Delphine heard herself say, her voice perfectly steady. "I'd be happy to mind the baby." "Wonderful." Constance smiled, that oblivious smile of someone who trusted that the people she owned would care for what she valued. "He's such a good baby. Barely fusses at all. I'll bring him to you around 6. After Constance left, Delphine stood in the kitchen and felt the plan crystallize with perfect, terrible clarity. Magnus gone. Constance gone. The baby in her care. The kitchen house, her domain, her only sphere of power, empty except for her and the child and the massive pot waiting to fulfill its purpose. That evening, the main house emanated sounds of domestic tranquility. Piano music drifted from the parlor where Constance practiced her pieces, the tinkling notes incongruous against the backdrop of suffering that made such leisure possible. Magnus sat on the veranda smoking his pipe, his boots propped on the railing, lord of all he surveyed. The cotton field stretched toward the horizon, the bowls white and ready for harvest, wealth growing from brutalized labor while the masters pretended it grew from the soil alone. Delphine prepared the evening meal with hands that no longer shook. The calm had become absolute, the dissociation complete. Part of her, some small, screaming part, remained horrified at what she was planning, but that part was locked away now, pushed down into a place where it couldn't interfere with what needed to be done. The rest of her moved with cold purpose, gathering ingredients, testing the sharpness of her knives, calculating timing and temperature with the expertise of someone who had spent 12 years mastering the alchemy of cooking. The kitchen had always been her only weapon. Now it would be her vengeance. She thought about all the meals she had prepared for the Weatherby family, all the care she had taken to nourish the bodies of people who saw her as livestock. She thought about the perverse intimacy of it, feeding those who would destroy her, sustaining those who would show no mercy, using her skill to prolong the lives of her oppressors. The cook as both mother and servant, the kitchen as both hearth and prison. But tomorrow night, the kitchen would become something else entirely. The pot would transform from vessel of sustenance to instrument of revenge. And Delphine, broken, brutalized, powerless Delphine, would invert the maternal duty that had been forced upon her and become the death-bringer instead of the life-giver. Her grandmother's voice whispered approval from whatever realm the dead inhabited. "The old gods are watching, child. They will accept your offering. They will remember your name." In the quarters that night, Delphine lay beside her rocking daughter and rehearsed the plan in her mind. Every step. Every detail. Every moment from when Constance would hand her the baby until the stew would be ready. She felt nothing now except the cold clarity of purpose, the mathematical precision of revenge, the terrible peace that came from knowing exactly what would happen next. The kitchen knives waited, sharp and ready. The herbs hung from the rafters, their purposes known. The pot sat empty, patient, anticipating the weight it would hold. And somewhere in the August darkness, cicadas screamed their eternal psalm while the plantation slept, unaware that the scales were about to balance in the most horrific way imaginable. The evening arrived with the weight of inevitability. Magnus departed for Little Rock just after 4 o'clock, his horse's hooves kicking up dust on the road that led away from Bleakwood Plantation, away from what would happen in his absence, away from the moment when the powerless would claim power in the only way left available. Delphine watched from the kitchen house window as he disappeared into the distance, and felt nothing, not relief, not fear, not even hatred anymore. She had moved beyond emotion into a state of pure, crystalline purpose. The August sun hung low and orange over the cotton fields, casting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the red clay. The air remained thick and suffocating despite the approaching evening, the kind of heat that made breathing feel like labor, that made the world shimmer at its edges as if reality itself were becoming uncertain. Cicadas had begun their twilight chorus, their voices rising and falling in waves that seemed to pulse in time with Delphine's heartbeat. She prepared the kitchen with methodical care. The fire in the hearth burned steady and hot, fed with hickory logs that would provide hours of sustained heat. The massive cast-iron pot sat centered over the flames, already filled with water that had begun its slow journey toward boiling. Around the workspace she arranged her ingredients, the turnips and carrots and onions that would provide the base, the herbs that would season and conceal, the salt and pepper and bay leaves that would transform raw elements into something that resembled sustenance. The knives lay in their neat row, edges catching the firelight. She had sharpened them that morning, the whetstone scraping against steel in a rhythm that had become almost meditative. One blade in particular, a boning knife with a thin, flexible blade designed for working around joints and separating meat from bone, sat slightly apart from the others, waiting for its specific purpose. At 6 o'clock precisely, Constance appeared in the kitchen house doorway. She wore a pale green dress suitable for visiting, her hair arranged in careful curls, her face flushed with the anticipation of an evening away from domestic responsibilities. Baby Thaddeus was bundled in her arms, wrapped in a pale blue blanket embroidered with yellow ducks that had been a gift from Constance's mother in Memphis. "Thank you so much for doing this, Delphine," Constance said, transferring the baby into Delphine's waiting arms. "He ate just an hour ago, so he should sleep most of the evening. If he fusses, there's a bottle prepared in the icehouse. I'll be back by 9, perhaps a bit earlier." The baby was warm and solid, heavier than Delphine expected. He looked up at her with curious blue eyes, Magnus eyes, and made a small cooing sound, his tiny fist closing around her finger with surprising strength. For one moment, holding this child who had done nothing wrong, who was innocent of his father's crimes, Delphine felt something crack in the cold edifice she had built around herself. This was someone's baby. This was a mother's son. This child would be missed, mourned, his absence a wound that would never heal. But then she thought of Clementine, her baby, rocking endlessly in catatonic silence, bleeding from wounds that might never heal, destroyed by this infant's father in an act of casual brutality that would never be punished, never even be acknowledged as a crime. She thought of all the enslaved children who had been torn from their mother's arms and sold away, of all the babies born into bondage whose innocence had never protected them, of all the suffering that the Weatherby family had caused and would continue to cause for generations unless someone, somewhere, made them understand that actions had consequences. The crack in her resolve sealed over. The cold returned, absolute and final. "I'll take good care of him, ma'am," Delphine said, her voice steady. "You enjoy your visit." Constance smiled, kissed her son's forehead, and swept out of the kitchen house in a rustle of green silk. Through the window, Delphine watched her climb into the carriage that would take her to Willowbrook Plantation 3 miles distant. Watched the carriage roll down the drive and disappear into the gathering dusk. Watched the last barrier between intention and action dissolve into the summer evening. Then she was alone. Alone with the baby, with the fire, with the pot, with the knives, with the plan that had taken shape in her shattered mind like dark crystal forming in a cave. Thaddeus began to fuss, his small face scrunching in preparation for crying. Delphine walked with him, bouncing gently, humming the tuneless melody that would later accompany her stirring, the melody that came from somewhere older than memory. The baby quieted, his eyes growing heavy, his breathing settling into the slow rhythm of approaching sleep. She laid him on the preparation table, on a folded cloth, and stood looking down at him. He was so small. So perfectly, terribly small. His tiny hands opened and closed in sleep, his chest rose and fell with breaths that came easy and untroubled. He would never know hunger. Would never know the lash. Would never know what it meant to watch someone you loved being destroyed while you stood powerless to intervene. He would never know anything at all after tonight. The human part of Delphine, the part that had been pushed down, locked away, silenced, screamed somewhere in the depths of her consciousness. This is murder. This is an infant. This is unforgivable. But the scream was distant, muffled, unable to reach the surface where her hands weighted steady and her mind had fractured into something capable of the unthinkable. Her grandmother's voice whispered, "The old gods hunger for balance. Innocent blood has been spilled for generations. They will accept this offering. They will remember." Delphine's hand closed around the boning knife. The blade was cold, sharp, purposeful. She stood over the sleeping baby and felt time slow, stretch, become elastic and strange. She could see multiple futures branching from this moment, the one where she stopped, where she returned the baby unharmed to his mother and continued living in powerless suffering, and the one where she moved forward into an act so terrible that it would echo through history, would become legend, would ensure that her name and her daughter's name would never be forgotten. The baby stirred, made a small sound of contentment in his sleep. Delphine chose. What happened next existed outside of language, outside of linear time, outside of anything that could be fully described without diminishing the absolute horror of it. The knife moved. The baby woke, eyes wide with confusion before pain and fear registered. The cry that began was cut short. Delphine could not bear to hear it, could not maintain her resolve if the child's suffering extended beyond the necessary moment. She worked quickly, her hands moving with the expertise of someone who had butchered countless chickens and rabbits, who understood anatomy and how to separate flesh from bone with minimum waste. The part of her that was still screaming grew louder, but she pushed it down further, deeper, until it was just white noise beneath the sound of her own breathing and the crackling of the fire and the rhythmic scraping of blade against cutting board. The pot bubbled, ready to receive. The vegetables went in first, the turnips and carrots and onions that would provide a bulk and familiar smell. Then the herbs, carefully measured, designed to season and conceal. Then the meat, piece by piece, each element placed with ritual precision while Delphine hummed her tuneless melody and felt herself splitting further from reality with each passing moment. Time became meaningless. It might have been minutes or hours that she stood at the pot, adding ingredients, adjusting the fire, stirring in those steady circular motions that would continue into the early morning. The kitchen filled with the smell of cooking stew, rich and meaty and unmistakably wrong to anyone who might have been paying attention, but there was no one to pay attention. The plantation slept. Magnus was miles away in Little Rock. Constance was laughing with her sister at Willowbrook, discussing fashion and gossip and the trials of motherhood. And Delphine stirred, and hummed, and felt the last tether connecting her to her humanity finally snap. She wrapped the small bones and what remained in burlap, the same burlap that had once held flour, and set the bundle on the preparation table with careful reverence. She tucked the edges in the way one might tuck bedclothes around a sleeping child. The pale blue blanket with its yellow ducks, she kept that visible, a small corner peeking out, because when the discovery came she wanted there to be no doubt, no possibility of misunderstanding, no way for anyone to pretend this hadn't happened exactly as it had happened. The stew simmered on. The fire crackled. The shadows danced across the kitchen walls in patterns that might have been grotesque or might have been sacred depending on which gods were watching. Delphine's hands never stopped their circular motion, scrape, stir, the rhythm becoming heartbeat, breathing, becoming the only reality that existed in this moment outside of time. Somewhere in the quarters, Clementine rocked in silence, and Delphine thought, "This is for you, baby girl. This is so they'll remember. This is so it means something. This is so your suffering isn't just another forgotten horror in a world built on horrors." But even as she thought it, she knew the truth. This wasn't for Clementine. This wasn't for justice or balance or the old gods. This was because something inside her had broken so completely that the only response possible was to break something else, to share the devastation, to ensure that Magnus and Constance Weatherby would spend the rest of their lives knowing the specific, intimate agony of having a child destroyed. The hours passed. The stew cooked low and slow, the meat becoming tender, falling apart at the touch of the spoon. The smell grew richer, more complex, the kind of smell that might have been appetizing if anyone had possessed the context to be hungry. But there was only Delphine, alone in her kitchen, her domain, her altar, her battlefield, stirring and humming and waiting for dawn to break and the discovery to come and the scales to balance in blood and horror and irrevocable loss. At some point, she heard the carriage returning. Heard Constance's voice calling goodnight to her sister's driver. Heard footsteps approaching the main house, then stopping. A pause. A long pause. Constance had remembered. Constance was standing somewhere in the darkness, perhaps on the veranda, perhaps in the yard, realizing that she had left her baby in the kitchen house and needed to collect him before retiring for the night. But she didn't come. Not yet. Perhaps she was tired from the visit, from the ride, from the evening's socializing. Perhaps she assumed Thaddeus was sleeping peacefully and decided not to disturb him until morning. Perhaps the universe was granting Delphine these last few hours of suspension, this time outside of consequence, this final moment before everything that came after. Delphine stirred the pot and hummed her tuneless melody and felt nothing at all except the cold weight of what she had done settling into her bones like winter frost. The baby was gone. In his place was only stew and burlap and the terrible knowledge that she had crossed a line so absolute that there would be no returning, no redemption, no possibility of ever being human again in any way that mattered. But she had never been allowed to be human anyway. That was the point. That was what made this possible. When you are treated as property, when your body is used and your children are violated and your suffering is ignored because you are not considered fully human, then humanity becomes a luxury you can no longer afford. What remained was only the cold mathematics of revenge, the dark alchemy of transforming powerlessness into the most terrible power of all. The pot bubbled. The fire crackled. The night deepened toward its darkest hour. And Delphine, broken, brutalized, transformed into something that could commit the unthinkable, stirred and waited for dawn and discovery and the moment when Constance Weatherby would finally, truly understand what it meant to lose everything that mattered. The old gods were watching, her grandmother's voice whispered. They have accepted your offering. Your name will be remembered. But the price, child, you knew the price would be everything. Everything. Delphine had paid it gladly. And in the morning, when the screaming began, everyone else would begin to pay it too. Dawn broke over Bleakwood Plantation with the slow inevitability of judgment. The sky lightened from black to deep purple to gray, the stars retreating one by one as the eastern horizon began to glow with the promise of another merciless August day. The cicadas that had screamed through the night gradually quieted, their chorus fading as the diurnal birds began their morning songs, mockingbirds and cardinals and crows, oblivious to what had transpired in the kitchen house while they slept. Delphine stood over the pot, stirring. She had been stirring for hours now, the motion so ingrained that her arm moved without conscious thought, the wooden spoon scraping against cast iron in endless circles. The fire had burned down to steady coals that radiated heat without flame, maintaining the perfect temperature for the stew that bubbled and simmered and filled the kitchen with its terrible, too rich smell. Her face held an expression of perfect serenity, almost beatific in its calm. The part of her that had been screaming in horror somewhere deep inside had finally gone silent, exhausted or perhaps simply accepting that the deed was done and could not be undone. What remained was only the hollow shell of a woman, moving through the mechanical rituals of completion, waiting for the inevitable moment when her private nightmare would become everyone else's reality. The burlap bundle sat on the preparation table behind her, the corner of pale blue blanket with its cheerful yellow ducks visible in the growing light. Small. So terribly small. A monument to what she had done, to what had been required of her to survive in a world that had given her no other weapon, no other choice, no other way to make them understand. Through the kitchen house window, she watched the plantation begin to wake. Jeremiah emerged from the stable to begin his morning chores, his movements sluggish with sleep. In the quarters, people stirred on their pallets, preparing for another day of labor in the cotton fields where the bolls hung heavy and white, ready for harvest. The machinery of slavery ground forward as it always did, indifferent to individual tragedy, sustained by the collective suffering of hundreds of souls whose names would never be remembered by history. But Delphine's name would be remembered. What she had done would be remembered. The horror she had created would echo through generations, would become legend, would be whispered about in kitchens and quarters and anywhere people gathered to speak of the unspeakable things that happened when human beings were pushed beyond the limits of what human beings could endure. At 6:47 in the morning, she heard it, the sound of panic approaching. Footsteps running, stumbling, desperate. The kitchen house door burst open and Constance Weatherby stood in the doorway, her hair disheveled, still in her nightgown, her face white with the sudden terror of a mother who had woken to find her child missing. Delphine. Constance's voice was high and thin with fear. Where's Thaddeus? I fell asleep, I didn't come get him last night, where is my baby? Delphine turned slowly from the pot, the wooden spoon still in her hand, dripping with thick brown liquid. She met Constance's eyes with her own empty ones and felt something that might have been satisfaction or might have been nothing at all. "He's at peace now, Mrs." Delphine said, her voice perfectly calm, perfectly steady. "Fed and content. He'll never hunger again." Constance didn't understand at first. Her eyes swept the kitchen, looking for the cradle, for the bundle, for her son sleeping peacefully somewhere in the shadows. "What do you mean? Where is he? Bring him to me." Delphine gestured toward the pot with her spoon, the motion almost gentle, almost maternal. "He's here, Mrs. Right here. I cooked him tender, just how you like the meat." The words hung in the air for a moment that stretched into eternity. Constance's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, the beginning of comprehension, the refusal to comprehend, and then, finally, the terrible understanding that crashed over her like a wave. Her eyes moved from Delphine's serene face to the bubbling pot to the burlap bundle on the table where the corner of the blue blanket was visible. She saw it then, something small and pale surfacing in the pot's bubble before sinking again. Something that might have been a knuckle or might have been a toe or might have been nothing at all except the absolute confirmation of a reality too horrific to be real. The scream that followed was not quite human. It was the sound of a soul shattering, of a mind breaking, of every assumption about safety and order and the natural way of things collapsing in an instant. Constance's legs gave out and she fell to her knees in the doorway, her hands clawing at her nightgown, her mouth open in a rictus of agony that produced sound beyond language, beyond meaning, beyond anything except pure, primal horror. The scream woke the plantation. Within moments, people were running, enslaved people from the quarters, the house servants, Jeremiah from the stable. They crowded around the kitchen house door, trying to see what had caused such sounds, trying to understand what was happening. When they saw Constance on her knees, saw Delphine standing calm over the pot, saw the burlap bundle on the table, a collective understanding rippled through them like wind through wheat. Someone ran for the main house to ring the bell, the alarm that was reserved for fire or flood or catastrophe. Someone else ran toward the road to intercept Magnus, who would be returning from Little Rock within the hour. The enslaved people stood frozen, caught between horror at what had been done and a grim, terrible satisfaction that one of their own had found a way to strike back, to make the masters bleed, to prove that suffering could flow in both directions. Constance crawled toward the pot, her hands reaching, still not quite believing, still hoping somehow that this was a nightmare rather than reality. Delphine stepped aside calmly to let her approach. Constance looked into the pot, saw what floated there among the carrots and turnips and onions, and made a sound like an animal dying. She plunged her hands into the boiling liquid, trying to retrieve what remained, and the skin of her palms blistered instantly, but she didn't seem to feel it, didn't seem to feel anything except the vast, annihilating loss. "My baby," she sobbed, pulling out pieces that no mother should ever have to touch, cradling them against her nightgown. "My baby, my baby, my baby." Delphine watched without expression. "Now you know," she said softly, almost gently. "Now you know what it feels like." The words penetrated Constance's grief for just a moment. She looked up at Delphine with eyes that were drowning in incomprehension. "Why?" she whispered. "He was innocent. He never hurt anyone. Why?" "So was my Clementine," Delphine said, and her voice held no anger, no triumph, nothing except a vast, echoing emptiness. "She was innocent too. Your husband took her in the barn 3 days ago. He beat me and made me watch. He destroyed my child, and you." Delphine's eyes focused on Constance with sudden, terrible clarity. "You knew. You saw my face. You chose not to see." Constance's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Because it was true. She had known something had happened, had seen the bruises and the blood and the vacant expression in Clementine's eyes. She had chosen the comfortable fiction over the uncomfortable truth, and had maintained the illusion of civilization by refusing to acknowledge the brutality that sustained it. And now she paid the price for that willful blindness. Now she held the consequences in her blistered hands, pieces of her son who would never grow up, never call her mother, never know anything except the brief confusion of waking and then the mercy of quick death. Magnus arrived within the hour, his horse lathered from hard riding. The news had reached him on the road, fragmentary, hysterical, barely coherent but terrible enough to send him racing back to Bleakwood with his heart in his throat. He burst into the kitchen house and saw his wife collapsed on the floor, covered in blood and burns and pieces of their son, and for a moment his face showed something almost human: grief, disbelief, devastation. Then his eyes found Delphine, still standing by the pot with her wooden spoon, and the grief transformed into rage so absolute that it seemed to fill the entire space. He lunged for her, hands outstretched to strangle, to tear apart, to inflict immediate and total destruction. But Jeremiah and 2 other men caught him, held him back, because even in the midst of horror there were laws and procedures, and Magnus killing Delphine himself would deny the legal system its opportunity to extract institutional revenge. "You monster!" Magnus roared, struggling against the hands that held him. "You inhuman monster! I'll see you hang. I'll watch you burn." Delphine met his eyes without flinching. "Yes, sir," she said calmly. "I expect you will. But your son is still gone. Your wife will never forget what she saw today. And you," her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried through the chaos, "you will remember my daughter's screams every time you close your eyes for the rest of your life." The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. Whatever he did to Delphine, however she was punished, it would not undo this. It would not bring back Thaddeus. It would not erase the image of his son floating in that pot. The scales had balanced in blood and horror, and no amount of vengeance would tip them back. The sheriff arrived by mid-morning, summoned from the county seat. The magistrate followed. They documented what had been done with the grim efficiency of men who had seen violence before, but never quite like this, never with such calculated precision, such cold determination. They asked Delphine questions, but she had retreated entirely into the dissociated calm that had carried her through the night. She answered simply, without emotion, confirming what was obvious to everyone. Yes, she had killed the baby. Yes, she had cooked him in the stew. Yes, she had planned it. No, she felt no remorse. How could she feel remorse for the only act of power available to her, the only way to make them understand what they had taken from her? They took her away in chains, loaded her into a wagon for transport to the county jail where she would await trial. The trial would be brief, a formality, really, since she had confessed and the evidence was undeniable. The sentence would be death, of course. Hanging, probably, though some called for burning given the particularly heinous nature of the crime. As they led her past the quarters, Delphine saw Clementine standing in the doorway of their shared cabin. Her daughter had stopped rocking. She stood upright, and though her eyes were still distant, still damaged, there was something in them that hadn't been there before, a spark of recognition, perhaps, or comprehension, or something that might eventually become healing. "Mama freed us," Clementine whispered, her first words in 3 days. "Mama made them see." Delphine nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and then she was in the wagon, being carried away toward her inevitable execution, toward the end of a story that had been written the moment Magnus Weatherby dragged her daughter into that barn. The execution came 3 weeks later, on a gallows erected in the town square where crowds gathered to watch justice being served. Delphine climbed the steps without resistance, her face maintaining that same serene emptiness that had characterized her since the night of the pot. When asked if she had any final words, she simply said, "The old gods remember. They hunger for balance." Then the trap door opened, and Delphine fell into whatever awaited beyond life, carrying with her the weight of what she had done and what had been done to her, the horror and the helplessness, the love and the rage, all of it bound together in an act so terrible that it defied categorization as simply evil or simply justified. The cast-iron pot was buried in unconsecrated ground at the edge of the plantation, too tainted to be used again, too heavy with dark memory to be kept. But no matter how they scrubbed it, the smell remained, that rich, wrong, too sweet smell of what had been cooked there. Eventually they gave up and buried it deep, marking the spot with nothing, hoping the earth would absorb the horror. But the horror did not absorb. It spread instead, seeping into the soil, into the groundwater, into the collective consciousness of everyone who lived at Bleakwood Plantation. Constance never recovered. She spent her remaining years in a state of persistent grief broken by episodes of screaming madness, especially at night when the memories became too vivid to bear. Magnus turned even more brutal, as if violence could fill the void his son's death had created, but his eyes carried a haunted quality that never faded. Within a generation, the plantation began to fail. Crops wouldn't grow properly where the kitchen house had stood, the cotton coming up stunted and diseased. Workers reported seeing shadows in that area at night, hearing the scrape of wood against cast iron, catching the scent of cooking stew when nothing was cooking. The enslaved people whispered that Delphine's spirit walked there still, stirring her eternal pot, humming her tuneless melody, waiting for justice that would never fully come. The story spread beyond Bleakwood, carried by travelers and traders, transformed through countless retellings until it became folk legend, ghost story, cautionary tale. Some versions made Delphine a monster, pure evil incarnate. Others made her a tragic figure, driven to madness by unbearable cruelty. The truth, as always, lay somewhere more complicated, in the gray spaces between victim and perpetrator, between justified and unforgivable, between the human capacity to endure and the breaking point beyond which endurance becomes impossible. Clementine eventually healed enough to speak, to function, though she carried scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of her life. She lived to see emancipation, lived to be free, lived long enough to have children and grandchildren of her own. And to all of them she told the story of her mother, not to glorify what had been done but to ensure that no one forgot the conditions that had made it possible, the system that had created such desperate mathematics of revenge. "My mama wasn't a monster," she would say in her old age, her voice steady despite the tears. "She was a woman with no power except the power to make them hurt the way we hurt. And she used it. God forgive her, God forgive all of us, but she used it." The kitchen house was eventually torn down, the land left fallow. But even now, more than a century later, locals claim the area remains strange. Dogs won't walk there. Birds avoid nesting in the nearby trees. On certain August nights when the heat grows suffocating and the cicadas scream their loudest, people swear they can smell it, that rich, wrong, unmistakable smell of something cooking that should not be cooked. And they remember the name Delphine, the enslaved cook who found power in powerlessness, who balanced the scales with blood and horror, who proved that when human beings are stripped of their humanity, they become capable of acts that transcend all boundaries of mercy or morality. The old gods remember. They hunger for balance. And sometimes, in the darkest corners of human experience, that balance comes at a price so terrible that it haunts us long after the actors have turned to dust. The pot remains buried somewhere beneath Arkansas soil, waiting in the darkness, still carrying the memory of what it once held, still testament to what happens when oppression pushes people beyond the point where being human is possible. And Delphine stirs still, in story and legend, in warning and remembrance, her wooden spoon scraping against cast iron in endless circles, her tuneless humming echoing through the generations, reminding us all that horror breeds horror, that cruelty begets cruelty, and that the most terrible vengeance often comes from those who have been given no other choice. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe for more macabre horror stories based on real historical events, and let me know in the comments what you think about the dark intersection of oppression and revenge in American history. What other forgotten horrors should be remembered?